this is Jessica Harrington, Director of Career Development with the Lighthouse, and today I'm going to talk about the perfect interview, whether it's virtual or in person. This is the last webinar in our 5-part webinar series. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about what purpose an interview can serve. And really what purpose it serves for you. This is a chance for you to really highlight yourself, your skills, your abilities, and your interests, how they relate to the position. It's a chance for you to learn about the employer and more about the position in detail. Assess whether this is a job that you actually want. Ask questions. And create a really good first impression. So what are employers looking for? Well, they want to know if you can do the job, will you do the job, and how do you fit in? And how do they look at all this? Well, can you do the job? What are your communication skills like? What was your education? Work experience that you have? Have you shown leadership through extracurricular activities? Do you have the appropriate computer skills or writing skills that would be necessary for this position? When we talk about will you do the job, do you come across as motivated? Are you excited about it? Does it seem like you want to be there? And in terms of how you fit in, a lot of this has to do with how you present yourself in an interview. Do you come across as somebody who's going to be friendly, who's going to fit in as part of their team? So in preparation for your interview, it's really important to sit down and assess the skills and knowledge that you have. Look through your resume, kind of refresh yourself to your experiences, and look at common interview questions. It's important to practice what some of those answers might be and ways to illustrate your strengths. You also want to make sure that you do some research on the career field or industry and the position itself. This research can include everything from salary requirements to common, software that you might have to use, things like that, competition for that company as well. And then you want to come up with some questions for the employer that really reflect the research that you did. And we'll talk a little bit more about questions in a bit, but, things like, what's the work environment like here? Things like that. Can you tell me a little bit more about your mission? I read about it on your website, and I'd really like if you could elaborate a little bit more on, this program or that program, things like that. So on that note of doing your research, what to research and how to research. So probably the best place to look is going to be the company's website. It's where you're going to find the most background information on the company, what their services are, things like that. You can also look on LinkedIn, Glassdoor, social media, Indeed, Facebook. There's all sorts of different resources for that. But what to research? Look at, like I said, the mission, the history, the vision of the employer. Have they won awards for different things? What's their reputation in the industry? What kind of structure does the company have? Services, are there some new trends in the industry that you should be aware of? And then, of course, it's really important to understand who their competitors are. So there's 3 types of questions that you're going to hear in an interview. There's open-ended questions, behavioral questions, and situational questions. An open-ended question is pretty straightforward. Things like, tell me about yourself. Tell me a little bit about your experience here. So it's giving you a chance to elaborate. And this is when it's a really good time to kind of have an answer to the tell me about yourself question. That's where you want to have that elevator pitch ready, where in 30 seconds you can say, well, I recently graduated from Virginia Wesleyan University with a degree in, I've had the opportunity to internship with blah, blah, blah. I was also involved with the soccer team. I had leadership roles in, various organizations, things like that. Have something ready to go. Behavioral questions are questions that say things like, tell me about a time when you had to deal with an angry customer, something like that. It's things that have happened that in the past, and they want you to explain to them. Situational questions are hypothetical situations. So what would you do if you realized a coworker was stealing from the office? How would you handle that situation? Something like that. So, and these can be very broad, but these are the three main types of questions that you're going to get when you go to interview somewhere. So when answering questions, regardless of what type of question it is, it's really important to use the STAR formula. The STAR formula is a good model to use when you're formulating your answers to questions. So you're going to start out by briefly answering the question and then giving an example from that experience, stating what you've learned, and then kind of bringing it all back around and explaining how it makes you the best candidate for the position that you've applied for. This is an especially helpful tool when you get the negative questions. So an example that I like to use for the number one question is, what is your greatest weakness? One that I like to use is, I tend to be a procrastinator. So if I just left it at that, it's like, oh, great, she's going to miss all these deadlines. But in reality, what I would say in an interview is, well, I've always been a bit of a procrastinator, so I've learned how to manage that better over time. I keep a detailed schedule. I set small deadlines for myself while working on a larger project to make sure that I'm keeping up with it. And then I make sure that I set a final deadline a few days early just to make sure that I have time to wrap things up and review everything. I also keep a detailed schedule and frequently update my to-do list. So what I did was, the question was, what's your weakness? And I took that weakness and I talked about all these steps that I've taken, the action that I've taken to kind of resolve that and make me a better candidate. And that's something that you can do for really, a variety of situations. Other negative questions that you might hear: tell me about a time when you made a mistake. What did you learn from it? Tell me about a time when you missed a deadline. What did you do? So these are opportunities, even though they're questions where they're talking about your weaknesses, they're opportunities for you to showcase how you've grown. Other things to keep in mind. There are certain questions that you should not be asked in an interview. They are questions that are actually illegal. They're not allowed to ask you about race, gender, religion, marital status, age, disabilities, ethnic background, country of origin, or sexual preferences. That said, if you do get an inappropriate question, you have a couple of different options here. If you're applying to, for instance, be a youth pastor at a church, they might ask you a question like, do you attend church? Which church is it? And that might make sense in that situation. But you're not obligated ever to answer anybody's question. And if you feel uncomfortable by a question and you know that it's inappropriate, it's okay to say, I don't think that really pertains to my ability to fulfill this role, but I'd be happy to talk to you a little bit more about my experience. Something like that. Just redirect the conversation. Now that said, maybe if someone asks if you're married and you are, and you don't mind answering that, it's okay. But I would be a little bit concerned if it were me, if especially somebody from human resources were asking you questions like that. So sample questions to ask employers. At the end of an interview, it's really important to have some questions prepared. I suggest having about 3 to 4 questions kind of ready to go and written down when you go. So a great question to ask is what the next step is in the hiring process. I always like to ask that at the end of an interview because it helps kind of give you a framework of when you can expect to hear back. So, you're not sitting there waiting by the phone, wondering what's going to happen. If you're thinking you're going to hear back that week and it turns out they're still interviewing people for the next 3 weeks, well, then you're probably not going to hear back anytime soon. So it's good to kind of understand all that before you leave that interview. So other questions that you can ask, what are challenges facing the person in this position? What types of training will I receive? How will I be evaluated? One of my favorite questions is, can you describe a typical day in this position? Are there additional qualifications you're looking for that we did not cover? Things like that. I think those are really good examples. Also, something like, what do you see as goals for this position? What are things that you would like to see happen in this office? Things like that. So another important thing when you're in the interview is your nonverbal communication. You want to make sure that you make eye contact when you're answering questions. I say this, make sure you're making eye contact, but don't make it weird. You don't have to stare them down the whole time, but just treat it like a normal conversation, as if you were talking to a friend, a professional friend, where you want to make sure that you're engaged, that you're smiling. You don't want to sit there leaning back with your arms crossed. Sit forward just a little bit. Show them that you're interested. If you can, avoid the ums, uhs, and you knows, the likes and whatnot. And I'm guilty of it myself. But if you can, try to kind of pace your speech and find ways, to kind of slow down the conversation if you need a chance to think things through, instead of sitting there and going, you could say something like, that's a really good question. And it gives you just a second. As you're saying it, you can be thinking, okay, what am I going to say? And I think practicing common questions and participating in mock interviews, things like that, helps to prepare you so you have less of those moments. Avoid improper language, avoid slang, and again, make sure you show that enthusiasm, make sure you're smiling. What to bring to an interview? Well, if you can, you want to have a padfolio, and in that padfolio, I would suggest having some paper or notepad, a pen, and copies of your resume. Also, just in case I ask for it, I recommend having a sheet printed out with your references as well. Things to leave in the car, your cell phone, or at least make sure that you place it on silent. The worst thing would be to have your cell phone go off in the middle of an interview. Do not chew gum in your interview as well. That's a big no-no. And then also, if you have like a large handbag or a big backpack or something like that, don't bring that in for your interview. If you carry a small handbag, that's fine. Or, a smaller professional bag, that's okay as well too. So, for many of us, we might come across virtual interviews at this point. There likely will be a lot of video interviews. So there are ways that you can prepare for this. I think that the interview tips that we've already discussed, understanding the types of questions, preparing, doing that research, that applies whether an interview is in person or online. Whether it is online or in person, you still want to have that excitement. You still want to be engaged. If you're doing a video interview, make sure your camera is on. You want to make sure that you test your internet, your audio, and your video prior to the interview. Close any extra tabs that you have open that might be slowing your computer down. I definitely suggest using a computer rather than a cell phone. Sometimes when you do a video call on your phone, you can get a weird angle and you don't really want somebody looking up your nose while they are interviewing you. And the computer gives you a little bit more stability, so it's not shaking and moving about. You want to make sure that you're in a quiet, well-lit, professional-looking space. And by that I mean, do not have an interview with your bed in the background or a messy room in the background, anything inappropriate, like, if you were, if you had friends over the night before or something and your house is a mess, and, make sure you pick all that up ahead of time. You want to dress professionally, at least from the waist up. Keep that professional shirt on. You want to treat this just like you would an interview in person if you can. And like I said, you don't want people looking up your nose. Make sure you're aware of your angle, your camera angle, so that you don't have any awkward moments there. And like I said, same interview rules apply. You prep the same way, you still smile, you still make eye contact. It's all just as important. Now, after your interview, whether it is in person or online, you want to make sure that you follow up effectively. So you want to make sure that you know what the next step is going to be. If they've asked for any additional information, say they need your references or they need a copy of your transcript, something like that, make sure you get that to them as quickly as possible. You also want to write a thank you note within 24 to 48 hours after your interview. And that can just be an email, but I strongly suggest trying to email everyone that interviewed you. If you had a panel interview and you can remember who everybody was, try to write a quick email, just very short, saying, good afternoon, I'd just like to say thank you again for taking the time to interview me yesterday. It was so great to meet everybody and learn more about the position. And again, I'd like to reiterate my interest in the position itself and express how excited I am about it. And sincerely sign your name. It doesn't have to be anything further than that, but it helps to set you apart, because I will tell you that not everyone writes a thank you note anymore after an interview, and it adds an extra touch and shows how invested you actually are. In terms of reaching out to the employer after you haven't heard back, if they told you you would definitely hear back by a certain time and another week or so has gone by and you haven't, it's okay to send a quick follow-up email, just kind of loosely stating, I just want to follow up to see if you have made any additional progress in the hiring process. Again, I really want to express my interest in the position. So, something like that. Do not ever, say something like, you told me I would hear back by now, but I haven't. You never want to come across aggressive or anything like that. You also, after an interview, you don't want to call them, over and over again asking if they've had a chance to make a decision, or if they've, had a chance to review. If they haven't interviewed yet, don't call them and ask if they've had a chance to review your resume. It can come across as pushy, and you really don't want that. It's a surefire way to not get a job. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at jharrington@vwu.edu. You can also make an appointment to talk about any questions you have about interviewing. I also am available to do mock interviews as well. If you would like to schedule a mock interview, you can do it through my Calendly. I actually have an option on my Calendly page where you can schedule a mock interview right there. Thank you all very much.